I have built a lot of these things in my day. For a long time, they were horrible, absolutely disgusting, super ugly. And that's mainly because building an admin dashboard, especially for somebody who's not a designer, for a developer, is pretty tough. There's so many like little tiny things that you need to pay attention to. And that's why today we're going to build this dashboard layout and not just build it, but walk through a whole bunch of different tips for how you can build any dashboard moving forward without slamming your face against your keyboard in frustration. Anyways, let's get started. So before I get into actually building out this dashboard, I just wanted to take a second to kind of explain how I'm generally thinking about designing different things that I'm working on as somebody who's not a great designer and how I get inspiration for those things. One website I think a lot of people have already used before is Dribbble. So that's dribbble.com. That's fantastic. Another really good one is mobbin.com. This is a little better for specific examples and specific flows. So you can come on Mobbin and find like full authentication flows and how those things work from a user experience standpoint. But that is paid. So for right now, we're just going to stick with Dribbble. Generally, what I'll do with something like Dribbble, if I'm building a dashboard or really anything else for that matter, is just come up and I'll look up, say, dashboard or landing page or whatever it is. And I'll start finding different examples that I like. This very first example, we're actually taking quite a bit from. Generally, though, what I'll try to do is take specific bits that I like from different designs and kind of turn those into something that is my own. And there's kind of specific pieces to how I do that, right? And the things that I'm actually looking at in what I'm taking. So I'm just going to open up a couple random ones. Generally I'd take a little bit more time in this. Maybe I would take all of these different designs and then I would put them in a Figma doc or something and make notes on them. But what I'm generally taking note of is why I like kind of what I'm looking at so that I can take all of those things and coalesce them into something that looks unique and doesn't necessarily look like everyone else's designs. So maybe, for instance, with this, maybe I like the colors, or maybe I like the fact that it has kind of the separated border card for the inner section of the dashboard. So I'll take notes of that. Maybe for, let's say, something like this, I like, one thing that sticks out to me is how they're actually using contrast with these cards over here. So they have a separated card from this first card that is using a different background color to really make it stick out from the other cards on the page. So maybe that's something that I can borrow from, so long as I'm actually thinking about why they're doing what they're doing, right? So it doesn't just look completely random. And I'll go through and I'll do that with a bunch of different designs. And then again, you can kind of pull from things that already work, that you know already work, that are designed by great designers. And that really helps you to build something that doesn't look absolutely terrible and doesn't work terrible, even though you may not understand why they're using the amounts of padding that they're using, for instance, or the types of font weights or font sizes that they're using. So yeah, that's pretty much all I wanted to get out of the way with this one. We can go ahead and jump into some code now. All right, so jumping into our code, I have a pretty completely bare bones Next.js project here. I've just kind of, removed some of the CSS and the basic layout and stuff. If you're not using Next.js, that's totally fine. I'm not even going to be using any Next.js specific routers or any stuff like that. I want to keep this usable for anybody who's just using React. So if you are using Next.js, that's great. I'm going to be using the app router. If you're not, don't worry about it. Now to start off, I just want to make the layout. So by what I mean by the layout, go back. What I mean by the layout is I just want to kind of figure out the size of my panels, right? So we kind of have a sidebar panel in this case for what we're making. And then we have this other main panel where all of our dashboard lives. Now, really the note that I want to make as we're doing this is just to think about how much space you actually want for these panels. And it's probably not as much as you think. The thing that I generally, at least myself, have done, I've seen from example projects that people have sent me, is that people will make these panels really big. They'll make the text really, really big. They'll bold things more than they need to. Notice you'll generally see pretty subtle highlighting. You'll see pretty small font sizes and icon sizes and things like that. You do want enough room for, say if someone were to search in the search bar that they can actually see what they're typing. If somebody has a longer email, that they can actually see their email. But you don't need to have this huge sidebar and like really, really big text, right? Like people are going to be able to read this completely fine. So I'm going to go based off of essentially the same kind of color palette and the same kind of layout. So I would like to also have a card that looks kind of like this with a background, the layout that looks kind of like this. So I'm going to come back over to my main project and really quick, just looking at the code that I have already set up here. So whenever I have my bare bones Next.js project here, I'm using TailwindCSS. I just have this page component that is going to be the entry point for my entire app. And then I also have my layout component where I've also added two styles already. So I've added a background of stone 100, which is just this RGB color right here, as well as a text of stone 950, which is this color right here. That's going to be the background of our page. And then we'll have a white card over here on the side. Inside of my source directory here, I'm going to go ahead and make a new folder called components. And then inside of components, I'm going to make two new directories, one called dashboard. And that is not a directory. Let me try that again. New folder, dashboard. and then one more that I'm going to call sidebar. Inside of each of these directories, I'll just make a component that matches this. So I'll say sidebar.tsx. You can create a basic little scaffold of a component like this. And for sidebar, I'm actually not even going to add anything just yet. We can just leave that blank. But then whenever I go into dashboard, I'll make a dashboard.tsx file like this. Again, just scaffold that out like so. And this dashboard, again, is going to be that kind of white card on the side. So I am going to add a couple of styles for that. You can say class name here, give it a background of white, give it some rounded borders. We'll say rounded LG. We'll see why kind of as we go through this, but I need a little bit of padding on the bottom for how this is actually going to lay out. And I also want to give this some shadow. And then this piece is going to be temporary, but I want to give this a whole bunch of height just so that we can see it kind of fill the screen. So I'm going to say height, let's say 200 viewport height, something like that. And now obviously we actually need to lay these out. So back over here in my page component, we can import each of these files. We'll say sidebar as well as dashboard. Now we should see our dashboard little text up here at the top, and then we have this card in the middle, but we actually do still want to lay these out, and I'm going to lay these out using grid. So I'm going to say grid up here at the top. I'm going to give this a grid gap of 4, which is, I believe, 16 pixels. That's going to be the gap between this and this, kind of the horizontal gap, or the vertical gap rather. I'm going to give it a padding of 4 all around the sides, and I'm taking note again of these things from this example. So I have this little bit of padding at the top from the way that they did that. I really like how that looks with the inset dashboard. And then finally, I need custom grid columns here. So I'm going to say grid calls, and then I can actually open up square brackets and define this however I want. I want my left panel to be 220 pixels. And then I want the rest, 220 pixels. And then I want whatever is left to take up the size of the screen. So we can do something like this. And now we should have a layout that is looking pretty good. Just really quick, I'm gonna go back into my dashboard component. I'm just gonna remove this text, and there we go. So closing up some of our other files here, I just wanna start by focusing on this sidebar, and we can kind of go one little component at a time. And we, again, are gonna do something pretty similar to this. So I wanna start with a kind of account selector drop-down type thing, like up here on the left. And I also really quick wanna make sure that this sidebar is actually sticky so that whenever we actually scroll up and down the page, this doesn't scroll off of the screen, right? We're just scrolling the main content. So let's start by figuring out how we can do that. There are going to be 2 pieces to our sidebar. So first I'm going to create a div like so. And inside of here is going to be our main sidebar content. So to do main sidebar contents. And then down here is going to be like a little kind of plan toggle. We'll say plan toggle for like changing your subscription, essentially. A lot of times you'll see this down here at the bottom left. It could also be a settings menu or something like that. But that's kind of what I'm getting at here, is that we're gonna have more content down here. And eventually what I'm gonna wanna be able to do is all of my content that's gonna live over here on the left, if the screen is too small or we have too many options, I want that to be scrollable, but I always want this kind of plan toggle thing that's gonna live down here at the bottom to be visible. So these will need to be separate panels. And to do that, I often use a little bit of kind of CSS math. We'll see what kind of, here, let's just jump into it and we can see what we mean. So up here on this div, this first div, I'm gonna add a couple of class names. I'm gonna add an overflow Y of scroll. I'm gonna add a position of sticky, and I'm gonna give this a top of 4. I want it to actually set down a little bit from the top, and that's because we also have some padding up here at the top. Let's set this to overflow really quick. And then I want to set the height of this panel. Now, again, I want the height of this panel to be the full height of the screen minus what I think the size of this plan toggle is going to be, as well as to take into account some of the padding up here on the top and the bottom that we're going to have. So to do that, I'm going to set height is equal to square brackets, and then I can say calc. Now again, this is going to be based off of 100 viewport height. If we come back over to page really quick and look at how much padding we have 16 pixels. That's going to be on the top and the bottom. So I can then say 100 viewport height minus, say, 16 pixels. Or actually, rather, that should be 32 pixels because there's padding on both the top and the bottom. And then just because I've already done this before, I already know how big that bottom element's going to be. So I'm going to say minus 48 pixels. And that's just going to take into account, again, this plan toggle thing that's going to be down here on the bottom left. Now we should be able to see, given I have a mouse hooked up, that we have a scroll bar popping up here, going from up here at the top down here to leave a little bit of room down here at the bottom for that plan toggle. And as we actually scroll up and down the page, we'll notice that this little scroll bar doesn't actually go away, right? So I'm scrolling on the main part of the page, and because this main card has a bunch of extra height, we can scroll that up and down. But our card over here on the left, where all of our navigation is going to live, is not actually scrolling with the main part of my content. Now I think this is a good start, but let's go ahead and jump into the account toggle. So I'm gonna create a new file called accounts toggle.tsx. We will scaffold that out like so, and then we can just go ahead and import that where our to-do is here, like this. Go ahead and go back into that file. And before we actually set up this code, I just want to take note of kind of some of the specifics of our example over here. So let me just zoom in a little bit so we can get a closer look here. And what I want to note is how they're actually using contrast with their text and kind of some of the size of their text that they're doing here. A lot of times what I'll see people do on kind of newer projects is they'll take, say something like the email or the text over here, and they'll make it really, really big. I kind of mentioned this earlier whenever we were talking about these elements on the side that we're going to get to in a minute. But you really don't need to make this super, super bold and in your face. They're doing very, very subtle things here to actually kind of denote the difference between the name and the email here, right? So they're using a little bit of difference in font weight, as well as a little bit of difference in font color, and just a little bit of margin between these elements, right? It's pretty subtle. They're not adding some, super, super bold black 900 weight text and making it text XL, making it like 32 pixels. And then this is way smaller. This is enough to draw your eye to say, oh, these kind of are two separate lines with, different amounts of weight given to them. So I want to copy something very similar to that. Accidentally exited out of my screen there, but back over here on my main page, we will remove this account toggle text here. And just so this isn't super, super painstaking, I'm just going to kind of drop in some of the code that I have here for the markup, and we'll walk over it. So on our wrapping div, I'm going to give it a little bit of border on the bottom. That is to make up this border right here. So there's this kind of very slight border. Again, this wrapper is around this whole thing. I'm giving it a margin bottom of 4 as well as a padding bottom of 4, and that's what's going to give me the space in between where my border is, as well as just a little bit of margin on the top, which is just going to set this down a little bit, and that's going to make it line up kind of with this little tiny border radius here. And we're going to need to take note of that later because we actually want to make sure, we're going to get to this, but that this element right here lines up with our main header bar right here. This is going to be a theme, I think, through a handful of these sections, but just having things line up well and using consistent styling, like for instance, you can tell that this account selector here lines up well with our bar over here. Little things like that really add professionalism and don't take a whole lot of work. It's just making sure that you kind of take note of these things and have the eye to say, okay, look at that. This text lines up well with this text. This line here lines up well with this line. And we want to make sure that we do that as we go through. So that's what we're doing here. Then finally, obviously, I just have my border stone here, just a border on the bottom. And now that we see we have a little bit of border right here, that should be enough to get us started. Inside of our div, I'm going to add our button element. Our button element is going to have a handful of class names. So a display of flex, a little tiny bit of padding just around the sides for whenever we hover this. Background of stone 200, only whenever you hover this. Again, this is very subtle. Remember, our background is only stone 100. So whenever you hover over this, it just gives a little bit of something to kind of denote that you are in fact hovering over something that can be interacted with. Then giving it rounded borders, transition of colors for that hover animation, position of relative, because we're going to have some absolute positioning here in a second. You'll see why. Gap of 2 between our elements with the full and items center. Now, the first element we're going to drop in here is just our little avatar. Mine is going to look like this, and I am just getting a free avatar from dicebear.com. If you check out dicebear.com, they have a bunch of just placeholders. You can use the same ones that I'm using, but for mine, just setting a size of 8, which is 32 pixels squared, rounded borders, shrink of 0 so that the flex doesn't actually kind of shrink this down, a background of violet 500, which is going to be our brand color for this project, as well as just a little bit of shadow. We should now see that pop up here at the top, and whenever I start hovering over my button here, we should see that very, very slight animation. Below my image, I want one additional div that's going to hold my text. This is going to need a class name of text start. And then I'm just going to go ahead and drop in my text, which is going to look like this. So we have 2 spans, one for my name and then one for the email. And again, note there's just a tiny little bit of difference between these, right? So text small versus text extra small. I am bumping up the font weight a little bit. And that's pretty much all that we have for the difference between these two pieces of text here. You could even possibly make this a little bit more subtle and it would be fine. You can do something like medium or semi-bold. You can kind of play around with this. But again, there's a handful of different things that you can do to kind of make something stand out from the page. It can be color, it can be size. It could be font weight, things like that. You don't need to slap every single trick in the book on every single element to make it stand out. This should be plenty to actually denote a difference between these different lines. And now finally, after this, I want to import some icons just to put over here on the right. And I am using a package called React Icons, just yarn add or npm install React Icons. And specifically, I'm going to be using the fi package. There's a whole bunch of different packages in here with different sets of icons. This is just the ones that I am using. Now, one thing that's a little bit unfortunate with this icon set, though, is they don't have a chevron up and down kind of selector like you see over here on the right. So I need to do both, and then I need to kind of position them relative to each other. So we will see how I ended up pulling that. And what I ended up doing is something like this. So I have both a down icon and an up icon. Both of these are absolutely positioned over on the right. So I'm going right 2 as opposed to, taking into account the padding. Then I'm going top of 50% as well as translating it back by 50%. But this little +4 and -4 is what actually gives me the separation. So if I save this, we should see that that looks about correct. Let me bump up the size of this a little bit. So you'll see that looks about correct right there. But if I remove those little plus and -4s like what I have right here, we'll see that they just overlap directly on top of each other. So this was my solution. Obviously, there's other ways that might be better or worse on how you can actually lay these things out, but this worked fine for what I am going for. And with all that said and done, we now have our account toggle. So now we can move on to our search experience. Moving forward from our account toggle, I would like to get to this little search bar that they have here. So I'm going to go ahead and jump back over to my sidebar. And I'm going to create one more new component that I'm going to call search.tsx. And for that, again, we'll just scaffold out a basic little component really quick and import that under our account toggle right here. Nice, there we go. So we'll see that we did take into account our spacing between our top bar and where our search bar is going to be. And again, I know I've already said this 3 or 4 times, but we're going to want to make sure whenever we get to this right panel with our actual dashboard, that things are kind of lining up, even down to the small things, right? So like this bar right here is going to try and line up with the header bar up here. And then our search bar is going to line up with the top of our actual content. Beyond that, I'm going to go ahead and jump into our search bar. Inside of our search bar, we're going to also have a little command menu thing, which we're going to get to. But because of that, I want to have 2 separate components next to each other. So I'm going to start with some fragments like this. And then the first one can just be a div. There's going to be a group with a couple of different kind of components in it that make up our search bar here. So I'm just going to add some class names, starting with a background of Stone 200. Again, it doesn't need to contrast massively with the background. I'm going to have a margin bottom of 4 for the content underneath it. Position of relative, because again, I'm going to have some absolutely positioned elements inside of this element. A little bit of rounded borders, flex, item center, padding X of 2, padding Y of 1.5, and text of small. Again, using our React Icons package, I'm just going to add this little icon right here for our little search icon. Then after our search icon, I'm going to add our input, which is going to have a type of text, a placeholder of search, and then a set of class names to get rid of this background right here. So width full, background transparent. Placeholder text, we're going to make a little bit lighter than the rest of the text, and then we're going to get rid of the little focus outline that pops up whenever you focus on an input, and that should leave us with something like this. And then finally, we just need a little menu icon opener thing, like they have a little slash here. I want to use Command K, and we're going to get to how we're actually going to set that up, because we're actually going to create the menu as well here in a second. But to do that is going to look something like this. Again, we're just going to be using React Icons. So I'm just going to use a span tag, a little bit of padding, text of small, flex, a little bit of gap between our elements here, item center, tiny little bit of shadow. Again, I'm not using, shadow XL. You can be a lot more subtle than I think we need to be a lot of times. Background of Stone 50, which is almost white, rounded borders, position of absolute, again, because it needs to be over here on the right, and then a right of 1.5 to inset it a little bit from the right side, and then just top of 1/2, and then a translate of 50% to actually center it with our element here. Again, you could totally do this with, nested flex boxes or whatever. I just like to use absolute positioning sometimes. Just saves me one extra div. I can understand that it can be a little bit confusing though to follow sometimes. So, there's nothing specific about how I'm doing this layout that is, some hard and steady rule, just how I laid this out. But now that we've got this, what is kind of the rule that I'm hoping to get to, or maybe not the rule, but the suggestion as you're building dashboards is to just kind of consider your users, right? So I built this search bar, and I think a lot of times if you're working on a side project, it can be daunting to build search, because if you want to build search into every single possible thing, that can be very, very complicated. But one thing that is not complicated is just helping users figure out where they're going around your site, right? So if you have something like dashboard, accounts, cards, transactions, et cetera, kind of like this example dashboard, there may be, these 8 or 10 different pages, but then there can be 20 different pages within each one of those. And for you as a developer, it's pretty obvious that you go from here to here to here to here. But a common pattern that is, being used more and more often is to actually use search to help people navigate between these different pages and the nested pages, so that if a user is trying to, say, reset their password, they don't need to try to figure out, oh, do I go to settings, or do I go to preferences, or where do I go? And we can do that pretty easily, again, with kind of a search. Now we're going to be using one, let me actually pull it up, called cmdk. So if I say cmdk, this is the package here. You can also just open up this site. Actually, no, let's go to the package and then to the GitHub. Actually, the package is probably fine. So essentially all that the cmdk package is an unstyled set of utilities that you can use to create a menu for search, essentially. So it's going to handle the inputs and then the different commands or the different results and actually filtering those out. It's going to help you group things together, things like that, showing empty states, handling things like that. And we are just going to use a basic example based off of this, which will then style up for helping our users search. So actually just staying on this page right here, I can just copy everything that I have right here. Give myself some room back over here on the left. And I'm going to create one more new file, which I am going to call command menu.tsx. And then we'll just paste in everything that we just copied. Make sure we actually have everything imported correctly here, as well as make sure that we are exporting our command menu right here. And given that I am using TypeScript, I'm also going to need to add some types to this that they don't have on their example. So our event here is just going to be a keyboard event. All of this code is essentially just adding a event listener to the document for any time you do Command or Control K to actually open up this element. Now, one extra little change that I also want to make though is I want the open and close state to also be controllable by clicking on our input here. So I'm going to take this piece of state and I'm going to hoist it up into our search component here. Make sure that that is imported, and then we can remove it from within our command menu component here. And instead we can take these in as props like this. So just taking in open and set open as props. Again, I need to import my types for these like this. Now we should no longer have any errors here. And with this, we can go ahead and use our component over here. So this is again why I use my fragments. Under my div here, I will add my command menu like so. Make sure we're actually passing in our props to our component right here. So our open and set open. And because these components are using some state, we're going to need to remember, only if we're using Next.js, of course, but to come up to the top of our file and say use client, else we're going to start getting some errors over here. To actually trigger this on click right here, because obviously that's not working yet, I'm going to come over to my input and I'm going to say on focus. We'll just immediately blur that input and set open to true. And now we'll see that whenever I click on this component, because this isn't actually styled yet, we just get this little thing down here at the bottom with our examples. This can also be shown and hidden just by clicking Command K or Control K on your keyboard. Now we can move to actually styling this up. So back over in my command menu, clean up my imports that I don't need here anymore. We'll start by coming under our label on our wrapper dialog command here and fix that to the screen and set 0, give it a background of some color. Now, whenever we open this up, it's not being put in some really weird random place. I also want to make sure that whenever we click on this background, we actually get rid of our dialog. So on click of our wrapping dialog, set open to false. So now if I click on this, it goes away. And then for the rest of our content, I actually want to wrap all of this in a div that I can then style up. So I'll say div, paste all of that back in. Whenever I actually click on this div, I don't want it to close my element, right? Because that means that you're clicking on the actual modal inside. So whenever we click on this, we're going to stop the propagation of that click. And then we will add our styles for this wrapping element. So let me wrap those around. I'm going to give this a background of white, rounded of large, shadow of XL. We can pop this out a little bit more from the screen. Border of stone 300 with a 1 pixel border. Overflow of hidden, a width of full, but a max width of 512 pixels, oh my gosh, and a margin of auto on the x-axis, as well as a little bit of margin from the top just to set it in a little bit. If we open that back up, we should now have something like this. If I actually click on my modal here, it does not go away. It only goes away if I click the background. And from here, it's really just a matter of continuing to style everything up. So I'm going to start with my command input. I'm going to give this both a placeholder value as well as some class names just to style those up like this. We're just taking the full height and setting this input to be kind of the header of this element. So now if I type in, Apple, that is not Apple. Apple, we get our Apple result. If we type in something that's not there, we get no results found. And for our empty state here, I would actually like to be able to use the text that we have typed in to show in our empty state. In order to do that, obviously, we're going to need to be able to track what the value is that has been typed into our input. So back up here at the top, I'm going to create a new piece of state that I'm just going to call value. On our input down here, in order to track that, we need to pass in our value and then say on value change, and we can just directly pass in our set state function like this. And now we can actually style up our empty state. So instead of my no results found right here, I'm going to drop in this copy that actually highlights what you've typed in that hasn't been found yet. So now if I type in banana, nothing is found, and we get some purple text here. Now, as you'll notice, you can have different numbers of groups that each have different individual items, and you can also just have individual items on their own. So we have like a group of letters here, which we would style under with a bunch of, individual letters, and then just individual items that might just be, in our case, like sign out. So you might have a group that actually links to one of your side navigation elements, as well as an item that just is an overall action that the user could take, something like that. And that essentially is exactly how I'm going to do this. So I'm going to go ahead and just remove all of our items that we have so far, and I'm going to paste in some of our elements. Sorry if that's a lot to paste in at once, but we will go over all of this. And one thing that I actually missed here is up on our list, we have to add a little bit of padding. That should look a little bit better whenever we type in. Yep, that looks a little bit nicer. But for our actual group here, what I'm saying is I have a group of different actions that you can take for a group called team. For instance, you could invite a new member to your team, or you could see the org chart of everyone who's in your team. I'm not going to go through and make a million of these. Hopefully you can just kind of see the pattern of what I'm getting at here and how this could actually help your users navigate through your site. But then beyond that, the styling is relatively straightforward. So I'm just making the actual title text a little bit smaller and a little bit lighter because that's not really as important necessarily as these individual actions. And then the style for each of these actions are exactly the same. So we're essentially just giving this flex pointer and then making the kind of style of whenever you hover over this similar to the style of what we had for our account picker toggle, right? So it's just white background. And then whenever you hover over it, you get a highlight saying, yes, do you want to click on this action, essentially. We can, of course, then go and add more of these. So maybe I want another grouping for my integrations for, helping users find their different integration services and different pages within integrations. And then, as mentioned, you can also just have these items directly separated out on their own, which I generally use for something like a sign out or something like that, or just a general settings page. And now again, if I type in, say, contact, it's going to just show me those options. If I say invite, it's going to show me those options. If I type in something random, it's not actually going to show me anything. And it does all of that filtering for us under the hood. Now, there are some other cool things that you can do with this package that we're not touching here. Feel free to dig into that for whatever's useful for your project. But for now, I think we can go ahead and move on to adding our sidebar items. So back over here in my sidebar, I'm going to create one new component that I am going to call, route select.tsx, and we'll just scaffold that out so that we can go ahead and import it over here under our search component. And this is just going to house all of our basic kind of dashboard options for navigating between pages. Inside of our route select, on my basic route class name here, I'm just going to say class name, and I'm going to add the space Y utility. This is just going to add even margin between all of our elements on the Y axis. So for example, if I just have, two buttons, one that says, button 1 and then button 2 or then button 3, it just automatically, well, I guess these need to be block elements. Last name, block. And then I could say, space 8 or something, and that will automatically give me my margin. So super, super useful little utility. For us, we only just need a tiny little bit of space between them all. And then as opposed to just directly adding all of our routes here, I'm going to come down. I'm going to create a new component that I am going to call route Route can just return a button. Obviously, this can return, a NextJS link component, or it could be, an A tag, depending on what you're using. Just because I don't know, what framework everyone's using, we'll just use a button for now. And obviously you can go and replace this with an actual link. Now I want my route to take in a couple of different props. So I'm going to want it to take in an icon to show over on the left. Again, I'm just doing this kind of based off of our example right here. So I'm going to want it to take in an icon. I'm going to want it to take in some text, and then I'm going to want it to take in just a Boolean denoting whether or not it has actually been selected. So to add those, again, I'm using TypeScript. I'm going to want selected, icon, and title. For our icon, we can import icon type from React icons. Just to start seeing all of this come together, I'm just going to go ahead and drop in all of our different examples. So it's going to look something like this. For a single route, it's going to have an icon. Only one of them will be selected. Obviously, this can also just be based on the route, depending on however you want to set it up. And then it will just take the title of the actual route. Go ahead and import all of these icons really quick. And obviously we aren't showing anything just yet, so that's going to go away. But now we can go ahead and style this up. So we'll start by dropping our icon component that we're passing in here like this, as well as our title. So just right under that, we'll add our title, and then our class names on our button to actually style everything up. Some of these are going to be conditional, so I actually need curly brackets and then some backticks, and we can start adding these in. Those are going to be set that are going to be our base styles, and then another set that are going to be our conditional styles. So our base styles are going to look something like this. So a display of flex, item center, justify start to put them over on the left, a little bit of gap between all of our elements with the full, so it takes the full size of this containing element, rounded borders, a little bit of padding on both axes, text of small again, transition added to box shadow, background color, and color. And then conditionally, based on whether or not this is selected, there's a couple of other things we also want to add. So I'm going to add a space right here, and we can drop those in. If our element is actually selected, then I want to give it a white background color, a lighter text color, and a little bit of shadow to make it kind of stick out. If it's not selected, then we can give it kind of a hover state, but we can also make the text a little bit lighter. So looking at that, that's going to look something like this. And I know that I'm kind of harping on this and I've talked about it several times, but I think the lesson to take from this, again, is that we should slowly add different contrasting elements until we feel like it's really kind of sticking out, right? Maybe you don't feel like this is sticking out enough. Maybe we can slowly come down and say, hey, maybe our icon should be our brand color or something. So that would be something like this, right? So like maybe we want a little violet background color for this or text color for this. But what I see happening so often with people who don't really, aren't taking the time to think about what they're doing is they will really blow things out of proportion. They will start with, their highlighted element will be, purple background and a thicker font weight and a larger font size. And it'll have, a super large amount of shadow, and the shadow is the same, violet color, something like that. And it really just starts to look tacky. So generally what I would start, the process I would generally take is starting with our kind of unhighlighted element and then adding more until we feel like we have enough contrast that this actually sticks out as being different from our other elements, right? So I guess just to kind of summarize that is slowly add contrast, right? Don't add all of your contrast. Start with, too little contrast and then add elements until you kind of subtly get to the point where you can feel like that element is actually sticking out from the page. But yeah, that's about it. So now let's go ahead and work on adding the element that's going to go down here, which is going to be our subscription plan selector. Back over here in my sidebar component, we're going to go ahead and replace this to do here with our new plan component. So in our sidebar files over here, you can say plan.tsx and create our new file. Then make sure that we import that over here under our sidebar, something like this. We should now see that popping up down here at the bottom. And we've already set our height. Honestly, we've kind of already implemented what I'm hoping to be the lesson from this little section of this video. But we've already set our height of this element to take into account the fact that this was going to be here, right? So my plan component here, I want to be 48 pixels tall. This 32 pixels was to take into account the padding around the page. And we've already set our over scroll Y here. But let's go ahead and actually set up our component, and then I'll kind of cover why I think it's a good idea to kind of set things up the way that I'm setting them up here. So in our plan, I'm going to go ahead and remove our static text here. And then on our div, I'm going to drop in my styles. So this I'm not directly taking from anything. I'm actually kind of taking this from the Firebase dashboard. Actually, they have a similar pattern where they have content down here on the bottom left. A lot of times you'll see a settings or something down here, or maybe a fold button or something that lets you squish your nav bar down. For mine, I'm just kind of copying this with a plan selector / support style little button thing in the bottom. But essentially, I will have a display of flex, position of sticky, and then note that my top here, because this is a different element from this other one, has to actually take into account where this is on the page. So similar to how I did my kind of calc thing over here, because these are separate elements, this also has to be sticky, and its top has to be 100 vpor height, minus also the padding and the size of this actual element. So those are where I'm getting those two values from. My height here, again, is set to 48 pixels, so that's what's coming into account over and over again here. I'm giving this a little bit of a border on the top and a little bit of padding on the top with that same border color that I'm using up here under my account selector. We should now see that we have a border. It might be a little bit hard to see. I can probably zoom in here. That we have a border that actually separates this section from the scrollable section above it. Now inside of my div, I'm going to add one additional div that's just a flex with item center and justify between to kind of separate our elements out. Inside of here, we're going to have some copy that just tells you what plan you're on, as well as the pay as you go. Again, I'm just using a tiny little bit of contrast. Both of these are the same size. One of them is just bolded, and the other one has a lighter font color like this, to actually denote that they are kind of separate and they should be looked at separately. And finally, I'm going to add a button for contacting support. This could also be, change plan. I just used support the first time, so we will stick with that. And this, again, just uses a tiny little bit of contrast, just a slightly different background color with a little hover state similar to our other elements like this. And that is all for the actual layout of this page. Now, the reason that I'm doing this the way that I'm doing it, and it seems kind of convoluted, is because I want to make sure that whenever I have a whole bunch of elements, I can kind of just zoom in to show you what I mean. For the time being, we only have a couple of different navigation options here. But you can imagine that if you had, 50 different navigation options or sub menus, and you know how dashboards can be, you have like a little menu that has 10 different options, each of which have 10 more. I want to make sure that I am actually able to still navigate to those elements. I'm kind of accounting for growth by the way that I'm building this, right? So eventually we're going to have too many options, or it could be, a smaller screen size or something. And I want to still be able to see my important little bar down here, but I also want to make sure that people can always access all of the options that they have within this list. Thus why these are separate elements. Only this one is scrollable. This one is always stuck to the bottom of the screen so that people can always, see their plan and access support, and that's not eventually hidden somewhere way down further down the page. And I think with that, we're kind of done with our sidebar element. So I'm going to need a little bit more room here as we move forward. Hopefully it doesn't get too squished here, but now we can actually move on to our main dashboard over here on the right. So we're done now with the sidebar component, meaning that we can move forward to the dashboard component, which is currently empty. Okay, so we can actually see everything here. Maybe hopefully that gives us enough room over here. But remember that our dashboard component is just the other component that is sitting next to our sidebar component. I'm not sure why this doesn't like this import, but it's working fine, so we can ignore it. But moving into our dashboard component here, the first thing that we're going to build is just a little top navigation bar. I guess not a navigation bar, but a little top bar up here, kind of like, I guess, similar to what we're seeing over here, right? We're just gonna have the name, we're gonna have the date, and then over on the right, it obviously doesn't have an example here, but over on the right, we're gonna have like a fake little date picker thing that obviously you can fill out if you would like. So inside of dashboard over here in my components, I'm gonna create a new component, which I am going to call top bar.tsx. We can just go ahead and scaffold out that component. Should look something like this. That should be fine. And then inside of our dashboard, we can just use that component, importing it like so. Now we should see that up here at the top. Note that we don't have any padding or anything yet on this card. That's because I want to be very specific with this step that we are aligning all of the padding and everything with this top bar so that it kind of fits the same type of height and space as what we're using for over here, right? Like I want my line, I'm gonna have an underline under this bar, and I wanna make sure that that line lines up perfectly with this line, and I wanna make sure that my text and my height of everything is the same height as this over here for my top bar. Just those little things, again, really make a big difference. And I think that's really the lesson to be taken as we build this out, is that make sure that you're really using your design eye and the fact that you're looking that everything is kind of lining up well. You don't really need to know every single little thing about design to kind of figure out that, okay, if one underline is here and then the next underline is down here, like in the middle of this, it looks a little bit weird, right? So just try and be specific as you put these types of things together. Back over here in my top bar component, I'm gonna go ahead and remove this text right here, and I'm just gonna drop in my wrapping class names on this outer wrapping div. Those will look something like this. So I'm really taking a lot of this from, let's see, what did the other component called? The account toggle, right? So this has a border bottom. We're looking at the same kind of margin and padding and the color of the border and things like that. Over here, we are using a lighter border just because there's a lighter background. But similar, we're going to do padding on the x-axis of 4 to kind of push all of the content in a little bit, margin bottom of 4 and a margin top of 2 just to push it down. That's going to line up similar to how we're lined up with this content right here. Padding bottom of 4 as well. And that's what's just giving us space between the content and the bar. And then inside of this div, we can go ahead and drop one more additional div that's going to be the wrapper around all of the content that lives up in this top bar. That's going to have a display of flex, item center, and justify between with just a little bit of extra padding. This padding 0.5 also matches this tiny little bit of padding that we have over here on our picker, right? So we still have a little bit of extra padding there. The content on the left side of this page is going to look something like this, or the left side of the bar. I'm just gonna have some basic kind of text up here, similar to our example. And again, these are being taken similar to the same kind of font sizes as we're looking at over here in our account toggle, right? So this is using text small, font bold, text extra small, and we can kind of do the same thing over here, right? So text small, text extra small. This doesn't necessarily, I'm not saying every time you have text next to each other, it needs to be the same size, but in this case, I just want these things to line up. I want to have 2 rows of text over here, similar to what I have over here. So it helps to kind of think about them the same way, have them be the same size. That way they line up well, and it just by default will kind of look a little bit better to your eye than having these different sizes. Outside of this div, I just want to have some kind of button over here. Obviously this could be, your notifications or whatever other types of things you want in your dashboard. But for mine, I'm just going to have a little calendar, like a little date picker type thing. Relatively straightforward. So it's just going to be a button with a calendar icon. And then, this, I'm not actually hooking all of this up right this second. Of course, generally you would use kind of an input with a date type or some kind of library for picking dates. But in this case, the placeholder is just going to be a button with some basic little styles on it. And that's going to be pushed over here to the right side. Whenever you hover over this, I'm adding, a different kind of hover state, which is just giving us this text violet and a background of violet 100, which is just our brand color in this case. And with that, we should be good for our top bar. So now we can go on to the fun part, which is actually building out our cards for our dashboard. Jumping back over to our main dashboard component, we can close our top bar. I'm going to add one component below this top bar, which is kind of going to house all of the rest of our grid. And as I say that, we're actually going to call that component grid. So I'm just going to say grid.tsx. Again, we'll just scaffold that out really quick. And then we can import that over here under our dashboard like so. And the reason that I'm calling this grid, as I'm sure you can imagine, is because we're going to use CSS grid to actually lay all of this content out. So on my class right here, add some class names. And for those, I'm going to give it a padding on the x-axis of 4. Remember, we already have some margin of 4 below on our top bar component here. So a padding on the x-axis of 4, a display of grid. I'm going to give it a gap of 3 between each of my grid items. So like each of my individual cards will automatically have a 12 pixel gap. And I'm going to give it a grid columns of 12. This way, each of my elements can selectively pick how many of those columns they want to take up. And we have a lot of room to work with for different sizes of elements. Now I'm going a little bit off of our original example now. I'm sure I actually picked this from something else, but kind of similar to what we're seeing here. Up at the top, I want to have a couple of sort of stat cards. They're going to look different than the way that this one is set up, but I want 3 stat cards up here at the top that are just showing, the high level stats of whatever this dashboard might be talking about. And I'm going to actually call those, as you could guess, stat cards. So over here in file, we will say stat cards.tsx. Create our components, and then import that over here, stat cards. Now stat cards is going to have 3 individual cards, and each of those I want to be able to lay out using my grid that I've already defined here. So as opposed to actually defining, a div, I'm just going to return fragments, and then each of those fragments can return an individual card. So we'll say const card down here. This of course is going to take in some specific props, but for right now we can just return, we'll just say a div. This can just say a BP of 4, and we'll just do BG black just so we can actually see that all of this is coming together. We'll add 3 cards up here. say 1, 2, 3 like this. And because we're using a 12 column grid, each of these should take up 4 columns. So I can say col span 4. And now we should see that we have 4 elements up here across the screen. Now I'm not working on making everything responsive in this video. That's definitely something that you can do if you want to actually extend this and use it for your own projects. But of course, what this allows us then to do is as the screen gets smaller, we could say, call span 12 instead of call span 4, and that will let our card take up the full space instead of just 1/3 of the space. It gives us a lot of flexibility in all of the different widths and the spacing between different elements. Giving myself a little bit more room now. This is probably going to squish as we actually lay all this stuff out, but I think that's all right as we kind of just go through making this. I am going to want my cards to take in a couple of props, and those are going to look something like this. So for each of them, I want them to have a title. The title is going to be like, what the category is that this is representing. The value will be like, say, plus $1,200 if this is say gross revenue or something like that. The pill text will be like a percentage. I think this example actually has something kind of similar to that. So yeah, so we're gonna have like a little pill instead of this little up 3%, but that's gonna be the idea is this pill text, and then the trend is either gonna be up or down. So in this example, this is like saying up 3%, the pill text would be 3%. The trend up would mean to make this green and have an arrow pointing up. And then the period will be the time period for which this represents, like this says last month. Of course, we're going to want to actually pass in some props for each of these. So I will paste some of those in. For my first card, it'll have a title of gross revenue with a dollar value like this, a pill text of some percentage, a trend of up, and then a period of say Jan 1st to Jan 31st. I'm just copying those down to each of these, but then each of the other ones just have something different. So an average order with some different value and saying that's trending down maybe. And then the last one was saying, hey, here's all of your numbers for the entire trailing year. Here's how much that is. And here's what the pill text is. We'll say that's trending up, for example. And with that, we can actually close up our main stat cards component. And now all that we need to worry about is actually laying out this card. And what I really want to drive across as we lay this out is that there are many different types of contrast that we can use, right? Like there's space between elements, there's size of elements. I know we've talked about contrast a lot, but I really think that these cards are a really, really good example of using all of them together to display a whole bunch of different types of information in one space. So we can use color, we can use contrast, we can use spacing, and we can use size. And all of these different things, when combined together, can kind of lead your eye to what is important within a grouping of information, right? Now, with that said, some of these classes are not exactly how I want them, so I'm going to replace them with what I'm actually expecting here. I still want my call span 4. I still want a padding of 4, but then I'm going to add rounded borders. Obviously, I want a 1 pixel border, and that border, again, will be a border of stone 300, which is this color. So now we should have something that looks a little bit simpler. We have these basic little white cards like this. And for the top row of these cards, I'm going to add one additional div with a display of flex, a margin bottom of 8. This, as we kind of see this come together, we'll note is how we're going to depict a extra little bit of separation between elements, right? So all of these are grouped together by the fact that they are in this same div that has the same kind of closing border, but we're adding a little bit of separation between this element and the element that's going to come below it by giving it some space, right? It's not using size necessarily, it's using a white space between elements. Then again, display flex, items start, so they're on the left, and then justify between, or they're at the top rather. On the left side of this element, I'm just going to add our title and our value. Our title is going to be smaller, also using the stone 500, so a slightly lighter color. We're going to need a little bit more space, or this is going to end up getting squished. But to the right of this div right here, I'm going to add a little pill component. I'm going to need to import these two icons. So it's the FI icons trending up and trending down. And by pill, I just mean that this has this little background color, and the background color is dependent on this trend. So if it's going up, then it's green. If it's going down, then it's red. So it's conveying information with color as opposed to just size. This is another way that you can kind of separate your elements from each other. And beyond that, this just has a very small text size, display of flex, item center, a little bit of gap between our icon and the actual text that is being shown, which is just the pill text prop, a font of medium, a little bit of padding around, and then again, just a little bit of rounded border around the edges of this element. One extra little thing that I'll note in terms of how I'm setting these colors up is that what I often see is people have the stronger background color. So say the dark green is the background, and then like a white text or something like that, which that really definitely sticks off the page. But if you want something a little bit more subtle, what is often a good pattern is doing something similar to what we're doing here, where the background color is actually a light version of whatever the base color is. So say green or red in this case. And then we just make the text color a darker variant of that same color. And that gives you something that looks like this, which is a little bit more subtle, but still kind of conveys the information that we're looking for. And now that all of this is in, the very last thing that we need to round out this card, if I give myself some space here, remembering my margin bottom 8 is already being added here, giving me some space, is some extra text just to show the period for which this stat is being pulled from. And now if we take a look at this card, kind of what I've been harping on, we'll notice that each element has its own way of separating kind of how important we think it is, right? So the most important thing in this card is very obviously the large text with the thicker font weight. Next to that is this information right here, which is still the second largest piece of text on this page, but it's a little bit less prominent because it's slightly lighter and it's slightly smaller, followed by this information over here, which is highlighted by kind of what the trend is versus some previous period. And then finally, the smallest piece of text and the lightest piece of text down here at the bottom. And with that, we can actually move forward to setting up our graphs, which will come in this next row. So closing up my stat card components and coming back over to my grid component, we're going to have two separate graphs. So one, I want to show kind of like a line graph, just showing kind of two different things that relate with each other. And another, I'm going to show a radar graph. And kind of what I want to get at with this is not to reinvent the wheel, and both not to reinvent the wheel in the fact that I see a lot of people, and myself included, getting excited about things like, D3 and trying to make really complicated, bespoke data visualizations, whereas there can be a time and place for that depending on what you're trying to show, but the majority of the time, you should just go with what the data actually needs. So if you don't have complex data, you probably shouldn't be showing a really complex graph or a really unique, specific graph, and you also really shouldn't be trying to build these things yourself, right? So using something like Recharts, this is probably my favorite graphing library for React. Very simple with a whole lot of really great basic examples on how you can actually use their graphs together. They have all kinds of really unique kind of specific things, or I guess not unique things, but a lot of ways to dial in how these graphs look and work. And they're very easy. So just jumping over to examples, for instance, if I want something like a line chart, we have 50 different examples of different types of line charts that we can use. And then we can come down and just copy this and drop it directly into our projects. And we'll go ahead and see how that works. So poking back over here to my main graph, I'm going to start with my, what I'm going to call activity graph. So over here in my files, we can create an activity graph component. Make sure that we scaffold that out and then import that over here in our grid activity graph like this. And by default, I want my activity graph to take up 2/3 of the width, right? So remember, we're using a 12 column grid rather. So we can use col span 8, and this will take up about the same width as, or the exact same width as 2 of my cards up here at the top. And then the next one will take up the other fraction. So we'll see if I save that. Now we have our text in here. We have a similar outline to our other elements like we have up here with a similar amount of border radius and things. And then instead of my activity graph here, I'm just going to go ahead and give this some kind of title. Now I'm wrapping this inside of an additional div, and below this div, we're going to have to do, our graph right here. And we can keep our heading here for our card, relatively simple. So I'm just using a little H3 tag here, keeping it at a base font size and just making the font weight a little bit thicker so this sticks out just a little bit from the page. Now to actually check out one of the examples, I'm just going to come back over here. We'll update this as we go. But to start, I'm just going to grab one of their examples. So we can just use this chart. I already have this installed. So I'll just import a couple of my elements over here. We're also going to need this data from over here. This is just basic data. You can grab that, paste that in, and then you'll see how this component is wrapped with a responsive container. That's going to be important here in a second. And pasting that in to see how that looks, we actually, I think, need to add a use client since we're in Next.js to this. Cool. There we go. And now we have this really big, crazy graph that is growing out of control. And that is because we actually need to set a size around this container. So we're using, or under the hood, this is going to be using, I believe, HTML canvas. and that needs to have a specific width. Fortunately, they have this responsive container helper function, but we still need to give this a container to kind of sit in. So we'll just wrap this with a div, add a class name on that div, and this can have just some fixed height. So we'll say height, let's say 64, and then we'll add a little bit of padding on each side. So px of 4, something like that. And now we should have a fixed size, and whenever we actually resize our chart now, it should actually handle resizing and doing all of the little animations and things automatically. Now, just taking a very simple look kind of at how this works, we have our basic line chart wrapper component here that takes in our data, and then we can kind of just compose together all kinds of little utilities that they have for actually piecing together these graphs. So for instance, this little Cartesian grid component in the background is just that little grid that was in the back of our graph here. We then have our x-axis and y-axis that can have, different font sizes. Like I can add class names to these and say text extra small. That'll make the actual text smaller. We can change the colors, things like that, and so on and so forth. But probably the most interesting thing, or the thing you'll really need to know first and foremost if you actually want to change this, is that if we look at our lines, so we have 2 individual lines right here, and we see that these have this data key attribute right here. One is UV and one is PV. I wish they used better names for this. I'm not exactly sure what those are meant to stand for, but we'll also be able to then scroll up and see that in our data, each of these elements has a UV and a PV amount, and we can change this to whatever we want. So we could change this to say desktop instead of UV, and we could change PV to, let's say, mobile. And now this is a graph of some kind of usage between desktop and mobile, and that would look something like this. You'll see that updated everywhere. So if you wanted a whole bunch of different graphs, or you wanted a whole bunch of different names for different elements, this is how you would do it. You could have a whole bunch of different keys for each of our different points, and that is how they would all line up. Obviously, you can also change the names of these, and those are our axis down here. And we'll see that that is defined by this data key down here on our x-axis is name, and so on and so forth. There's all kinds of different customizations that you can make. I'm not going to go, super deep into every possible little tiny thing that you can do with these graphs. Feel free to check out their documentation. There's also a million different tutorials on how recharts works. But for now, I'm just going to grab my old example that I've already built out of a nice looking graph, and we can go over that really quick with the different changes that I made. So I'm just going to replace my example right here with a example that I've already built out, and that looks like this if it will load. Oh, that's not loading because I also need to change the data. There we go. So here is my example graph, and we'll notice that the colors I just adjusted a little bit more. So if I scroll down here, we can come to our lines. I changed the stroke and the fill to use colors like my brand color for one, and then one of the stone colors, which I just got directly from TailwindCSS. So these are just a couple of the Tailwind colors that I'm already using in other places, just to make sure that this actually matches the brand of the rest of the page. I'm also updating kind of some of the font colors and things, cleaning up this little tooltip a little bit, giving it a similar border and some rounded edges, as well as updating the X and Y axis to make them a little bit smaller, and then giving this a little bit of negative margin on the left. Sometimes if you go to your actual main chart component, you can pass in margins like this. And what you'll notice sometimes it's a little bit offset. I'm not really sure exactly why that is, or if there's a better way to fix it than this, but what I generally do is just bump around these margins until it seems like it lines up the way that I want it to line up. And with that, we can now move on to our next graph, and I'm going to use a very similar pattern for this next one. So I'm just going to come up here, I'm going to make a new file. This one I'm going to call usage radar.tsx, and this is going to use a radar chart, which if you haven't seen one of those, I will show you in just a second. Just import this really quick down here, and then we can come back over to the documentation and look for radar charts. So yeah, they have 2 of them down here. You can click on one of these and see what those look like. So they're these kind of graphs. I'm sure you've seen these before. You can layer different things on top of each other, similar to this, which is exactly what we're going to be doing. You could just go through and copy everything from in here again and play with it from there. I already have one built out, so I am going to use that. So back in my radar chart file, or my usage radar file, I'm just going to drop in the one that I already have. We will fold the text so we can actually see it. And that should look something like this. So as far as colors and things, I did a lot of the same things, right? Like I'm using brand colors the same way. I also added a little legend down here at the bottom. And just to walk through this, we can kind of look at how I have this set up. So remember that we can kind of name different things and use them how we want. So I have mobile and desktop. Subject, maybe a better thing would be like feature or something. We can even update that if we want. We could say feature instead of subject. It's probably just from my original copy paste. And what this is pretending to kind of show is different amounts of usage across mobile and desktop for different features in some kind of application. At least that's kind of the basic idea that I'm going for here. Down here, as I mentioned, I'm using a call span of 4 here because remember this one is a call span of 8 and we have 12 possible columns in our grid. Rounded borders and the same amount of padding, the same kind of styling for our heading here as we're using for our other card. And beyond that, it's just the basic graph components with extra styling that I copied directly from Recharts. And with that, I think we can move on to our last section, which is just putting together a basic table. Now, one last time back over in my grid component, I am going to make one more final new component, which I am going to call recent transactions, if I can spell. And for this, I just want to create a basic grid component, or not basic grid, a basic table component. So if you were made an HTML table before, that will look pretty similar to what we're doing here. For our wrapping div, we're going to use some styles that are going to make this take up the full size. Remember, we're call span 12 again, a little bit of padding, a border again, rounded, using the same kind of styles that we're using for all of our other cards so that this matches. And again, I'm going to copy the same type of styles for the heading row here as what I have over in these. So I have my activity and things like that, except for this one, I'm also adding this little see all button over here on the right. Of course, right now this isn't taking you anywhere, but you know, in your instance, maybe this is some kind of link that takes you to somewhere where you can see all of your transactions. Below this div, we can go ahead and create our table. So that can just be a normal table component, setting width to full, and I'm setting table layout to auto. And for our table head, I'm actually going to create a component. So I'm going to call that table head, and we'll just make this in the same file. We'll just come right down here, say const table head. This doesn't need to take in any params or anything. I just wanted to kind of clean this up a little bit. And this is going to return our table head element with a single table row and these sets of items. So there's nothing fancy going on with this. I'm just, giving these size a text size of small, a base font weight, making the text a little bit lighter than the rest of the text that's going to come below this. And then for each of these, giving them a little bit of padding, making sure they align on the left side of the column. And I do have one additional empty row here. That's because on the right side of each of my items, I'm going to have a little ellipses, like a view more type drop-down thing. Now, under our table head, we can create a T body for our table body. And similar to what I did with our table head component here, I'm going to create a table row component. So we'll say const table row. For right now, that can just say return a table row. And we are going to have a number of these, and I will say this many for now. Now for each of our table rows, obviously we need to pass in whatever parameters are going to match with all of this content. So we're going to need to be able to take in a couple of props, which I can go ahead and drop in really quick to our component here. So we need a customer ID, a SKU, which is just like an identifier for this item, the date that this happened, the price, and then order, which order I'm just going to use. This could be like an incrementing ID or something. If you're mapping over this, it could just be the index. But I want to be able to make sure that every other of my rows has a different background color. So we just have like a white background and then a slightly off-white background just to separate all of our rows a little bit. As an example of actually passing all of these in, obviously we need to pass in our props. So I'm just going to drop a couple of these in here. We need, a customer ID, which can be anything. The SKU, we can just say pro 1 month versus 3 month versus annual or something like that. The date that it occurred, the price that the user paid for it, and then the order. So 1, 2, again, like I said, this is just auto incrementing, or not auto incrementing in this case, but just incrementing 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And now we can move on to actually laying this out. I'm sure this is not the most interesting part of this tutorial because it's just basic kind of layout, but we can kind of take it one little piece at a time. So for our table row, as mentioned, if this is an odd element, then we can, or an even element, we can give it a background of stone 100, else it'll just be transparent or just white in the background. And each of them can just have a text size of small. This way, each second row essentially has this background color, giving us this kind of stepped feel. And then just going through one column at a time, starting with our customer ID. That's going to look something like this. So each of our data cells is just going to have a little bit of padding. This first one is going to have a link with the customer ID to presumably go and look at more of this customer's information, their previous purchases, things like that. The next 3 items are literally just going to show the text. So it's just going to show the SKU, the date, and the price. And then finally, for my last element, I'm just going to show a little button, which is, presumably going to be some kind of like view more button like this, like what we have over here on the side. And we'll see now kind of what I was talking about with the stepped background colors. Now, the only thing that I really want to call out here is that we're using color purposefully and meaningfully. Let me open this up now that we're kind of done and it's a little bit easier to see what's going on here. So we're really only using color when it makes sense to use color. We're not just blowing this purple brand color out all over the place because that can make it a little bit harder to look or to find what you're looking for. So we're using that to kind of draw our attention to different elements, right? So we have like our see all button over here. It makes it very obvious that this is something that I can click on. I'm not doing this and then the next element has some kind of pill or something. And then this has like, it's also purple and has some kind of date icon or something. And then the price is green and is, really blowing itself out of proportion when it doesn't need to be. I'm only using color in places where I want to actually draw somebody's eye, which makes it a lot easier to look at this whole table and actually find what I'm more than likely actually looking for here. One last little thing that we can do is over here in our dashboard component, we had this fixed height of 200 viewport height. We definitely don't need that anymore. I was just using that to kind of show this scroll. And now I think we're actually kind of done. So let me open this up a little bit. Maybe I will close this out. And now we can see our full dashboard layout like this. Again, kind of noting all of the different things we did. We have a separate scrollable little element here. We have everything really lined up well. I'm actually going to turn my mouse off to get rid of these scroll bars. Of course, you can keep those on. It's probably better user experience to keep your scroll bars on. You can style them though, of course. But we have our separate elements over here. This side is already scrollable if we want to get there. If we open up our search, we allow our users to get down and dig into whatever feature they're actually looking for very easily without needing to dig through, maybe a bunch of different pages. We're trying to do a really, really good job here of using things like white space and color and font size and font weight to actually give us different amounts of importance to different elements that are on our page. And we could continue to run with this as we build out our entire dashboard. And with that, I think that's everything I wanted to cover for today. If you got anything out of this, I would massively appreciate a like and a subscribe. I'm also working on a Framer Motion course. That's at blast.dev. If you're interested in joining the waitlist for that, you'll get a discount whenever that comes out and you'll be updated on, all of the progress I'm making on that, as well as hover.dev. If you're interested in learning more about UI animations, Hover is a component library that I run filled with a bunch of different cool animated UI components specifically for React, Tailwind CSS, and primarily Framer Motion. So beyond that, I hope you learned something today. Leave a comment if you think there's anything else I missed or any other tips I should have covered in this video. And beyond that, I'll see you guys next time. Peace.